Tonight we have a special guest interview with Dr Neil Schultz, a forensic psychiatrist. Now he's going to be talking to us today about trading psychology. And to get him started off, thank you very much for coming tonight, Neil. We appreciate it a lot. What would you take on trading psychology in general? Would you like to tell us a little bit about it?
Well, when you read a lot of information about this subject, people talk very commonly about fear and greed. And while that is a useful dichotomy to consider, I've never really felt that it actually captures the important aspects of trading psychology, which is actually a much broader topic. One of the real problems that I have with that is that it doesn't really capture what people experience. And for most part, that is an anxiety response. And I think for us to understand trading psychology, you really need to understand anxiety.
And so, I mean, what is anxiety in a nutshell for us? Well, how does it affect us as individuals and I suppose on the body as well? And particularly, those of you out there who would be trading tonight, or even traders in general, might be thinking, how does it affect the trader when he's sitting at the desk?
Well, before you can consider what happens to traders, you actually have to understand the basis of anxiety. And for that, you've really got to go back to the very beginning of mankind, in fact, even before we became human beings. Anxiety is what keeps us alive and has kept us alive in dangerous situations. So imagine, you're somebody been roaming the earth many, many thousands of years ago, and the saber-toothed tiger looking for you in the jungle. And at that time, your body is aware, or you become aware of this saber-toothed tiger chasing you, and your body prepares to do something about that. And it's called the fight or flight response. It's a very physiological response, and we continue to use that exact same process, that same physiological response in all sorts of situations we perceive as dangerous. One of the difficulties is that we don't often encounter saber-toothed tigers anymore.
So what happens in the circumstance of when we are thinking about it from that trading element? I mean, if there's no saber-toothed tiger anymore, but we still get that same emotional response, or that physiological response, I suppose would be the right way to put it, how does that actually affect us?
Well, the physiological response really starts with the perception. So your brain, or some part of your brain, needs to say there's a danger. And from there, it sends a signal to your adrenal gland, and you have adrenaline released. And so you've usually heard about an adrenaline rush, and this is the beginning of that process. So once that happens, you will begin to have physiological changes which prepare your body for a fight or for a run. So what that means is that you stop using things that you don't actually need to be doing those activities. So for example, your gut actually becomes less active, and people know that happens because they begin to get butterflies. Sometimes in serious cases, they might even vomit. On the other side of that same coin, then you'll find that people need to prepare themselves for that activity, so their heart rate increases. Sometimes people will get palpitations, their breathing rate increases, and with all of those things, they begin to also get a bit dizzy, because with increased breathing rate, you do get dizziness. But perhaps the most important aspect of all of this for traders is that their brain function changes.
How does that actually change the brain function? I mean, I assume it has something to do with making more errors or mistakes when they are in that sort of circumstance.
Well, not quite. I mean, when you're in a very dangerous situation, your need to be focusing on certain things changes. So you need to focus on the things that you perceive as being the most dangerous. So people actually get a very narrowed attention. So it's almost like they're only seeing a very narrow view of the world. And if you're trading, you'll see people become very fixated on literally watching that price go up and down by one pip at a time, instead of actually looking at the bigger picture or being able to consider other things. You find they also lose the ability to actually concentrate effectively, and they're much more likely to be irritable or angry or even frightened, depending on how the market's treating them.
So it almost sounds like in this instance, it sort of focuses your field of view, and you're unable to sort of take the bigger picture as to why it might be happening. So it might be looking at a longer term trend, but only being able to identify the short term retracement and assuming that that is not a part of the same picture.
That's a fair comment.
Okay. So moving on those effects on the brain, I mean, what other effects are commonly associated with this sort of, anxiety? Are there long-term effects, short-term effects? Do we find that there is better opportunity to be, presenting with other symptoms that might indicate to us that it's not the right time for us to be trading?
Well, if you're already in a trade, it's hard to actually come to that conclusion because you're there. But I think one of the important things that people fail to do is recognise what's going on. So if you don't recognise that you're anxious, then you can't do anything about it. And there are things you can do about anxiety, both in the moment and as a preventative measure. But in order to really to work out what to do and when, you need to be monitoring your own anxiety. So all those symptoms I mentioned before, those symptoms, I guess, will be much more prevalent in an extreme case, maybe where you've got a panic attack. But you can be aware of those things occurring much earlier. So you can be aware of your heart rate going up. You can be aware that your breathing rate's going up. And you can be aware that you're feeling tense or beginning to feel a bit concerned or irritable.
Okay, so for those of you out there that might be watching tonight, if you're feeling some of those feelings, don't panic. You've now recognized your first series of symptoms of trading anxiety. Now, what might we actually look at for the next sort of effects that we would anticipate? Like, how might we be able to reduce some of those anxieties or control them?
Well, one of the things to consider is that anxiety is almost like a threshold problem. So for the vast majority of people, you can have an anxiety level, if we score it between 1 and 10, you can go from 0 to 8 without necessarily being obviously aware of being anxious. But once it goes over that level 8 marker, you can actually be very much aware of it. So the idea is to actually try and capture your anxiety before it gets to that threshold.
And is everyone's threshold different?
People, not really. People tend to actually respond to anxiety differently, to the extent that some people will tolerate more stress before they are aware of anxiety. But there are other factors at play there that aren't really related specifically to trading. They're more related to their particular personality style, how they actually manage anxiety in general in their life, and those sorts of things.
Okay.
And you can modify those things too.
So how would someone who might be new to trading and interested in learning about it, or has possibly even noticed that they've had some of these effects of anxiety, how would they actually go about putting a plan in action to help them before they start trading perhaps, or even during the trading? If they recognise these symptoms, what would be the most important aspect to improve their trading performance or even reduce some of those anxiety levels?
Okay, but look, I think there are really 4 things that you need to really consider. The first is your knowledge. A lot of people, particularly people who are starting out, don't have a thorough knowledge of what's going on. And they become anxious because things happen in the trade that they're perhaps not expecting, or they knew about but didn't think it could ever happen to them, or all those sorts of things that occur. So the deeper your knowledge you have, the better you will be able to manage those sort of anxiety issues. You'll have less reason to get anxious because you know what's coming.
Okay, so that becomes more better knowledge towards the trading.
Yes.
and having more understanding about what actually goes on market forces.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why people who are very experienced, they have a lot more knowledge than somebody who is a novice. And so you would expect that somebody who is very experienced will generally have less anxiety, but certainly their knowledge will be leaps and bounds above the novice. And so the more, and most people who trade know that you can never learn enough. And so the more learning you do, the better off you will be, provided that learning is organised and done in a way that you can make sense of it.
Okay. And so what about the next sort of steps? I mean, we've gone through the idea of more knowledge.
So the next step is practice. So one of the things, again, you see that novices don't have, that because they don't have a lot of experience, they also tend not to do a lot of practice. They will read about a new strategy and sit down at the computer for the market, and then they will just start trading. So it's important to practice. to actually get a feel for what's going on in an environment that doesn't matter. Now, that can include demo accounts and things like that, and there's a good reason why people don't like demo accounts, because it doesn't give you the real thrill. But in some ways you actually need to experience that sort of process to understand the theory of what's going on behind it before you actually commit yourself to it. And another thing to consider is that trading is a little bit like a performance sport.
How do you mean? I can't picture myself on surfing and then, considering that to be a part of my trading regime, other than perhaps the wave down.
Well, hopefully not too often, but I think the reason that's similar is because when you're playing a sport that is performance oriented,
Yes.
you have a very limited amount of time to basically bring everything together. And as much as possible, sportsmen do their thing every day using muscle memory. They don't have to think through every part of the process. They don't have to think about how they're going to kick this ball or how they're going to hit the golf shot, because they have it ingrained so much in their muscle memory. And traders, young traders or early traders, tend not to do that. They get into the market and sit in front of their computer and they are thinking everything because they have to. They haven't actually practiced it. Developing muscle memory is a really important part of that process.
And so in this instance, it's about developing and making those skills for trading almost become second nature, if not second nature entirely.
Exactly right.
Whether that be, the placement and fixtures of stop losses and take profits, or what to do when a position goes wrong, all of it needs to really be set up and in place that you can do it without actually having to think the process through.
That's right.
Okay.
So if you have enough committed to muscle memory, for want of a better word, then that gives you the flexibility to actually consider the finer points when you're in the process and not the basics.
Okay.
The next part of the process, again, you can take it from a performance sport, is routine. So when people sit down to trade, it's important to actually go through a routine, a checklist, if you like, of all the things you need to make sure of before you're happy to pull that trigger. And again, if you compare that to the sportsman, or think of the golfer who stands up on the tee, and you can watch them go through a very organised sequence. And if that sequence gets broken, they will typically start again. Tennis players are often noticed for doing exactly the same thing. They bounce the ball X number of times, and if something goes wrong, they have to stop and walk away and start again.
Maybe that's what's wrong with my golf game. I haven't been able to work it out yet, but this sounds like he's onto something here.
So in trading, I believe it's really important to have a routine and make sure that you use that same routine every single time you enter or exit or add or delete from a trade.
I'm sure this has been quite informative for a lot of you out there who may not have ever considered the anxiety sides of the implications. I'd like to thank Dr. Neil Schultz for joining us today. Thanks for being a special guest.